Story time with Stephanie Story.
Hello, welcome to Story Time. I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey, and my guest today is a historical novelist. She writes about primarily underrepresented or underreported women's stories from history. And I'm particularly looking forward to today because we have met a couple of times on the road at events, but we have never, like so many women who I sit down with next to on a panel or something, I've never really had a chance to have a really good in-depth conversation. So hearty welcome to the show, Elise Hooper.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted. I feel the same way. I'm delighted to have some time to chat with you.
Oh, good. And I realized I did not read off your list of books, but they are the Other Alcott, Learning to See About a Female Photographer, and forthcoming this summer, should have coordinated with the Olympics, Fast Girls, a novel of the 1936 women's Olympic team. So these are the primarily novels. I do want to start with Fast Girls, since that's the one that's coming out this year.
Yeah.
Which is about three women who were joining the track team of the 1936 Olympics. And it was, I presume, to correspond with the Olympics this summer, since it was coming out in July.
I mean, I hustled pretty hard these last few years to get this book ready for this summer. Hopefully it'll get a bump next summer if the Olympics happen. I mean, hopefully in some form they will still take place. There are thousands of athletes all over the world who have spent years, their whole lives training for this. So, I mean, of course, I have my book on my mind, but really I hope these athletes get a chance to participate, to compete, because otherwise they'll be waiting at least another 4 years. So.
And a lot of this book, and correct me anywhere where I'm wrong, but a lot of this book is about these three women's struggle to get on the Olympic team. It's interesting to me that you go right to the people and their struggle to get on an Olympic team. What did you learn about that process that makes you so empathetic toward them?
Well, in the case of the women in this book, the three women, and they're based on real historical figures, are Betty Robinson, who was the first woman she competed in the first ever year women were allowed to run track and field in the Olympics in Amsterdam, 1928. And then she is preparing to race in 1932 in the Los Angeles Olympics and suffers a horrific accident. I don't think I'm revealing any big spoilers here. I mean, part of her story is this amazing comeback where she returns to race again. I mean, she had been told she'd never walk again, much less run, yet she comes back for 1936 to put in quite a showing with Helen Stevens, who is a remarkable athlete. Her Olympic record from 1936 in the 100-meter held for another 20 years. But who knows Helen Stevens' name? I mean, she's a really amazing athlete. And then Louise Stokes, who is one of the first African-American women ever to qualify for an Olympic team, both in 1932 and 36. So my novel starts really in 1928 as Betty's preparing for that first Olympics, and the novel takes us right through the Berlin Games in 1936. So it covers three different Olympics, and qualifying. I mean, the Olympics were such a different endeavor back then than they are today. I mean, on so many levels. But really, I mean, Betty Robinson, for example, is discovered in 1928. So mind you, that's a couple months before the Olympics. One of her teachers sees her running for the train in her little suburb of Chicago and says, she looks really fast. And the next day he brings her out for a time trial, and she is so fast that a few races later, she has made it to the Olympics and is racing in Amsterdam. And so the trajectory, of course, is very compressed compared to athletes who spend really, I mean, I think most of those athletes today are, starting their sport when they're like 3, 4, and 5, and really never looking back. They are intensely competing in that for much of their lives. These women, it was a quick trip sometimes to the Olympics for athletes back then. It was just a much smaller field of people, especially for women. Women were so new to the Olympics They had started competing as early as 1900, but only in a couple select sports. And the events open to them kind of increased a little bit every year. And so by 1928, they had finally decided to let women's track and field happen. Here we are today in 2020, while women are almost at 50% of the Olympic field, women still do not have equal number of events open to them that men do. So.
Really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
It's
yeah.
even.
Yeah. Participation has grown from women from pretty much steadily 1960 till today, but still not equal number of events.
So when you found this story of these three women, did
Yes.
you already know a lot about it, or did you find it and have a ton of questions about it, and that's why you wrote a book? Because I always feel like it's one or the other, right? You already either obsessed with it or you just really want to be obsessed
right.
with it.
Well, I've always been obsessed with the Olympics. Like, I grew up figure skating until I was about 12, and then I stopped, and I played a bunch of different varsity sports all through school, but I am like, I've always wanted to be an Olympian. I mean, I still am kind of like, what sport could I pick up that could get me to the Olympics? Still, like, is it too late? It might be. So actually writing a novel, I mean, this way I got to go to 3 different Olympics, right? But yeah, I have always been a huge Olympic nut, in both winter and summer. I mean, I love it all. And I have so many fond memories through the years of things I was doing while I watched the Olympics. Like, I love it. I have a lot of strong memories with my family of watching. Now with my own kids and husband, we, on opening ceremonies night, always make a dinner or order in from a place. We have a menu that reflects the country where the Olympics are happening. We get pretty into it. So I'm like a legit super fan, I think. But what happened was, my younger daughter is a swimmer. She swims year round, and she, in 4th grade, needed to do a biography project for like a library assignment. And she picked Trudy Ederle, who was the first woman to swim the English Channel. And Trudy had also competed in the Paris Games in 1924 and won several medals. So she was a very accomplished swimmer, and her time, she had this huge success with the English Channel. I mean, President Woodrow Wilson called her America's best girl. Like, she was a huge celebrity at the time, and she's kind of by 2020 today slid into obscurity, but she was a big deal. And so my younger daughter was doing this project on her, and it really got me thinking, here I am, I played sports my whole life. What's the story with pioneering athletes, like women trailblazing athletes? I knew there was a story that predates, Title IX's signing into law in 1972. I knew there was a lot before that, but I just didn't know anything about it. I mean, we know Jackie Robinson. We know some men who broke down barriers, but we don't know much about the women. Really, it's like Billie Jean King. Some of the women tennis stars are sort of our big names that we know now, but there's a history before that. Because I said women started competing in the Olympics as early as 1900. Although, fun fact, the first woman to win a gold medal didn't even know she was competing in the Olympics. She just thought she was entered into a golf tournament. So again, the Olympics have changed a lot over the years. Yeah. So when my daughter was working on this project and Trudy Ederle was really inspiring to me, I started digging around. And to be honest, I still play adult league tennis. Like, I'm a huge tennis nut. So I was looking kind of for a historical tennis story. And I landed on these women track stars. I think Betty Robinson was the first one I found because of this accident where she is truly mistaken for dead. She is brought to the coroner's, and he notices her chest moving up and down, and she's, saved.
She's
but
in the coroner. She's
yeah.
Oh,
A guy like finds her in this field. She's been in a plane crash, and he brings her to the morgue, thinking, because it's the Great Depression, hoping he was going to get a little money for bringing a body. I don't know if he did. And so So yeah, so then first I found Betty, and then I'm digging around in Helen, and then Louise. And so these three women, they are all right in the same time frame, but they have really different paths to the Olympics, very different stories. And I just needed to know more. So this story kind of fell into my lap, and I was totally waiting for it, because while my first two novels have been about artists with May Alcott and then Dorothea Lange, I was just jonesing for a story about athletes. And this one has been so fun. I mean, every time I work out, I feel like I'm channeling them.
It is really interesting, though, that you grew up ice skating,
Mm-hmm.
and you are active. You do still play tennis. You do still do you do still have all of this physical inclination. And yet your first two books were focused on artists. So where did that visual art interest come from?
So I was an art history minor in college. And so I took studio art classes really my whole life too. So, but yeah. I mean, I'm not any good, but I love doing it. So those novels in many ways were a way to channel another real passion of mine and interest, which is art. And so that's kind of when I found the story about Fast Girls. I couldn't believe it had taken me a little bit to think about, to kind of look at sports like that. I really hadn't, I'm embarrassed to admit, with the sort of long history I have. I mean, I grew up even watching the Boston Marathon every spring run through my town. So, I mean, that was history in the making when the first, I was not born when the first women started racing it in the late 60s. But, I watched Joan Benoit, who went on to win gold in the first ever women's Olympic marathon in 1984. I was big fans of all these people. So I think the story has been in my DNA. I just didn't really know it till now.
Is there any similarity between that competitive streak in athletes and a competitive streak in artists? Like, was there anything that you found in common between the three of these stories, or were they all super different?
No, I think actually that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think all of these books are about self-discovery. I mean, they're all really about women in many ways surprising themselves. In the case, really all of them, now that I think about it, I mean, none of these women really, I think, necessarily set out to become what they ended up. But with that said, even Dorothea Lange, who was very ambitious, she started off thinking she was going to be San Francisco's leading portrait photographer. She saw herself as a businesswoman with a craft, with a trade. It took her still a while to view herself as an artist. So I think all of these women were very ambitious and tenacious, but I think their journeys surprised them in many ways, all three of them. All three of the women in Fast Girls, and then May Alcott and Dorothea Lange. I think they all surprised themselves to a certain degree, because all of these women were trailblazing in their respective fields at a time when there were so many obstacles. And so I don't even know if they all fully, I mean, maybe May Alcott, now we know her as having been this very ambitious artist from a young age, but it still took her, there was still a fair amount of confidence building, I would argue, on her side too, to become truly the woman who leaves Concord, Massachusetts, travels to Europe to kind of make her own name, to write a book, to do all of that. I think while she had kind of a great vision, I think it sort of took her a while to even really realize that she could actually do it.
Do you think, did the Me Too movement change the way you've written about women in history? Did it have any impacts on the way you see their struggle in any way?
That's a really interesting question, and no one's asked me that. But that was all happening as I was working on Learning to See, and Fast Girls, obviously, because I would consider this an ongoing, right, movement. But when I was writing Dorothea's story, she was really a woman creating space for herself at a time in a very male-dominated field. Well, there was certainly opportunity for women photographers to make names for themselves, because unlike painting that had a very sort of set caste system, very male-dominated for centuries, photography was kind of a new thing. So there was space for women to rise to the top of their field. With that said, she had to get studio space. She had to do all these things within this world of men. And I did really think, like, there was no way she could just waltz in and get what she wanted just from simply being asked. And several biographers kind of made these implications, like, what did she do for this quick, she, for example, obtains her first studio in San Francisco very quickly. And one of the biographers of her who writes about her, especially, I'd have to go and look and see when the biography was published, but he makes an implication of, like, who knows what she did for such a quick rise to the top. Well, I did think about that. I'm sure she dealt with harassment. Of course, she's never described anything like that, but I'm sure she did. And so I did think about that. And when I was writing that part of her story, I did go out of my way to talk about how she had a friend meet her at the restaurants where she'd have dinner with her partners, because I did not believe that Dorothea was self-righteous to a fault almost in a lot of ways. I really didn't think she'd sleep her way to the top by any stretch. I had a feeling she figured out ways to move ahead while still being true to herself and not having to, not to say that if you've obviously had suffered from harassment or anything, you've brought it upon yourself at all. But I think in the 30s, she had to go so far out of her way to try to make her way in a man's woman. I did think about a lot of that. And so with Fast Girls, I mean, there are issues of sexual abuse in Fast Girls. Helen Stevens in particular is trying to figure out her sexuality as the book progresses. So all of that was definitely on my mind. I mean, I think it's all on our minds probably all the time in a lot of it. I mean, in the ways that women are talked about, women writers, I mean, as we work as authors, all of this, the stories we choose to write about, how we tell these stories. I think I think it's a great awareness that we all have now that has taken far too long to reach this point.
Okay, so one thing that you and I have in common, we've never talked about, is you've worked in TV and news. I've worked in TV for freaking 20 years. I know what it's given me, the neuroses, the positive, the good, the bad, all of it. What did starting out your career in TV and news and that whole part, what did it give your writing, do you think?
Well, I think the biggest thing it's given me is that you can't be precious about, needing your like creative time. I mean, you gotta write. If you've got a deadline, like you've got a deadline. And so I don't think there's any fairy dust out there that helps you can sprinkle on your desk and you can suddenly write something. I mean, it's a discipline. I would also say that sports has really helped me with that. Like playing sports my whole life. I mean, you have to be motivated and disciplined. You have to be willing to hit 10,000 balls or whatever. Like I feel that same way about writing. So I think the best thing I took away from journalism was a sense of like mercenary, it's just, you do it because you have to. It's your job. It's not sort of a hobby that you're just doing when the mood strikes. If you're serious about writing a book or any big writing endeavor, it's practice. It's I always have people say, like, how do you make time for your writing? And I think it is what I do. I don't make time. Like, that's my day. That's the emphasis of my day. And when I was still teaching and doing, and I wasn't yet started seeing myself as a real writer, like before the Other Alcott had been, I had found a home for it at William Morrow, I was waking up at 5 a.m. to write every morning because I had I have young kids. And so I think when you want to do something creative, it's not just something you do when you kind of feel like it. I think it's something you do. Sometimes you feel like it and sometimes you don't, and it doesn't matter. You have to just sit and do it.
Speaking of less precious about your work and finding time, how is ye old pandemic treating your creativity?
Right.
Because I have heard a range of stuff from people.
Yeah.
I've heard some people say it's really tough and they can't really do anything, and other people say, oh no, I'm working. How is it treating you?
Yeah, I have been working like crazy, to be honest. I definitely take a lot of comfort into finding sort of patterns with the past, or I'm working on a book right now that's set during World War II. And, well, there's a lot of talk of us being at war right now, and we're not. I mean, there's a big difference. And so I feel I take a lot of comfort in the fact that people have done hard things in the past and they've made it and they've been okay. And I really am optimistic that we will be too. And so I can really relate to some of the anxieties of the 30s and 40s, and that people felt as they didn't know, suddenly their lives are turned upside down and they don't really know what's coming and they feel like this is forever. I am really channeling that right now into my current work in progress. And I was actually traveling. I was in Asia in February for several weeks, right up until February, was it 29th this year? Because of leap year. Yeah. The day they closed schools in Japan and everything, I was arriving there. So I managed to leave early. But so, yeah. So, I mean, I had been really tracking this pandemic for a while because I had this trip scheduled, and I talked to various doctor friends of mine and wasn't sure, should I go, should I not? And one who's an epidemiologist actually had said, I don't think you're going to have to decide. I think, the borders are going to start closing. And when they didn't, when I was leaving on, I think it was February 18th, I left. But now I realize, I mean, when you read these articles in the Washington Post and New York Times that really break down what we knew and when, I shouldn't have gone. I mean, our borders should have been closed. If the government had been maybe more responsive to what scientists were telling them, that trip may not have happened.
How did it, I have to ask really quickly, how did it feel while you were over there for those couple of weeks before you came
Right.
home?
Well, it changed a lot. I mean, when I first got there, my destination really was the Philippines, and I spent almost 2 weeks there. I'm working on a new book project set there. And so it was, I mean, everyone was busy and going about their lives. Now, I was keeping an eye on that because at the end of this trip, I was supposed to spend a few days in Japan, and Japan had the cruise ship. I mean, Japan had some issues. And so I was tracking it. But to be honest, the biggest thing that changed was that suddenly the US started getting all freaked out. I mean, Europe was happening while I was, cases were starting to emerge in Italy and Germany while I was in the Philippines. But really what started scaring me was at home here. And I'm in Washington State, which is where things first seemed to be sort of blowing up in north of Seattle here in a nursing home. The day I landed here in SeaTac Airport was the day someone died at that life care center, and Washington declared a state of emergency. Incidentally, not that I would have known it at the airport, because no one asked me any single questions about where I come from or seemed concerned at all. Yeah. So it was, I mean, I think I'll look back on that trip. It was a crazy time to be traveling.
You're gonna look back on that trip and have this face, like, oh no,
I know.
what happened?
I know. I mean, what I feared was that we wouldn't be allowed back in the United States.
Yes.
And that was a real concern there, especially in those last few days right before March. So I was really glad that my airline allowed us to move our flight home a few days early. And then, boy, I was just so glad to be home. So glad to be home. And then that's really the phase where things were just changing hour to hour. New cases here, new cases there. Suddenly this country announcing this and that. It was just so nuts. And so, but that's when I had this trip that was research fresh in my mind. I was like, I have to work. I mean, I have to start moving ahead on this project while it's all still sort of fresh, churning away. So I think that's been a real blessing for me, that I've been able to be focused on a real time of crisis in the past. And that's sort of bolstered me these days.
You're so brilliant, and you think about all of these things so deeply, and it's so nice to sit down, hear somebody who's taking these things seriously and really putting all their passion into it. And I love that you found being passionate about your athleticism, your lifelong athleticism, and you put it into this book. That is a beautiful thing.
It has been very satisfying. I mean, too, with your work on these Italian painters, like when you can pursue a great passion like this and write about it and make it your life's work, I mean, that's as good as it gets, in my
Story
opinion.
time with Stephanie Story. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Story.